So, some time ago I went to go and see Warcraft, the latest film adaptation of the fantasy video game franchise of the same name by Duncan Jones, and being unfamiliar with the material but very enthusiastic given the indie sci-fi director's filmography prior, I was very intrigued to see it. And to put it simply, I got bored. Really bored. The film, as it turns out, was an absolute snooze. Its mythology was unclear, the story was generic, dry and cliché, and the characters so thinly sketched it would have been difficult to care about anything happening even if it were easy to follow. So yeah, pretty dull all around. But then something interesting happened. Later that same week, I went to go and check out Gods of Egypt. Since there was nothing else out at the time, my mate and I were eager to watch a film, and I'll admit I was kind of eager to find out why it garnered such negative reviews in the US. And on that occasion, I had an absolute blast. Not because the film was any good, mind you, to the contrary, Gods of Egypt is a pantomime of bad decisions and misguided casting choices. Seriously, the whole thing feels as though it's been directed by some alien trying to comprehend the ways in which humans interact. The gods of Egypt are as white as they come, the performances are hilariously hammy, and the effects in green screen compositing is bad enough to provoke flashbacks to Spy Kids 3D. And yet, I found the thing so intriguingly shocking and laugh-out-loud terrible that I ended up really enjoying myself. And I'm being completely genuine here, Gods of Egypt doesn't land a single joke or make any of the players in the story interesting, or even offer up the most basically convincing CG matte painting, but I couldn't not have fun with it. And this contrast in viewing experiences got me thinking. Because while I'd argue that Warcraft is the much better film in the technical sense, it's got good production values, the motion capture and animation work on the orcs is really well crafted stuff, clearly money was spent on this thing, the overall direction is better, and there's certainly a lot to admire in Jones's faithfulness to the games when it comes to the adaptation process, I still managed to walk away from arguably the lesser of the two having had a much better experience. One partial reason for that might lie in how either film chooses to execute its own exposition with regards to its own respective mythology. While the overall attitude and aesthetic of Warcraft implies that we should all invest super seriously in the whole orcs, knights and wizards deal, the film ultimately never truly tells the audience just how this world exactly works, opting to just go straight into things without much exposition. And while there can certainly be something to admire in not dumbing things down for us regular folk that haven't had anything to do with the already established franchise and just going straight into the story, well, it turns out that that story it decides to explore is more or less unengaging, monotone, depth-deprived plotting. Everything we see or hear concerns getting to characters, elements or places in this world that we're just expected to have a general idea of, and then even after we've been sort of introduced to them through their appearances, we still get given no frame of reference for who or what they are and how exactly they work, let alone why we should care. We might know that the orcs have travelled from their world to that of the humans, but are those the only two worlds? How many exist in this reality? We later discover that other creatures coexist with humans on this world, so did they originate from the same land as them? How do wizards factor into all of this? Why do people hate them? Are they traditionally viewed as antagonists? Who's in charge of this world? What the fuck was that stuff in heaven with Glenn Close? All the rules are never laid out to us, so you do spend a majority of the film just rolling with whatever happens, and by extension choosing to not really care about what's going on. Either way, the characters are never lively or engaging enough to make worrying about things like that superfluous. Gods of Egypt, on the other hand, surprisingly, I was able to follow because the film opens with an expository prologue panning over hieroglyphics as the narrator informs us of what the gods exactly are, the relationship they share with the humans, what they can do, and why it should matter. Now, granted, there is still a lot that we're not told. The film still wants to leave some things in the air so that the main human protagonist can be taken on an enlightening journey regarding the details, but it's enough to mean that, for instance, when a comically over-the-top Gerard Butler magically turns into this weird-looking robot dog thing, see, I told you this movie was good, as dumb as it is, I understand why it's happening and I accept it. But while I do think the Gods of Egypt doing a far better job of establishing its mythology than Warcraft is an interesting thing to note, like seriously, Gerard Butler turning into Iron Man Scooby-Doo makes more sense to me than green magic equals evil, that still doesn't ultimately explain my enjoyment, more just that I was able to follow one better than the other, and in a lot of ways I actually think the explanation rests in something far simpler: tone. I don't know about you guys, but one of my biggest pet peeves with bad movies these days is when they're not even enjoyably so or enjoyable period. when they're so intent on going for the now safe, gloomy, self-serious approach that they become too insistently humorless and unambitious to even be entertaining in any kind of way. It's virtually impossible to sit through something like Divergent, but had it included the odd, unique, perhaps more ambitious moment that might have played more comically misguided than boring, we might be remembering it more fondly today. It comes down to a matter of taste, of course. If the film's gonna be bad, I'd gladly endure Batman and Robin for its campy, dumb, kid-friendly goofiness over the pretentious, self-important grim and grittiness of Dawn of Justice. For example, Jim Henson's Labyrinth, on a script level, isn't very good. Its themes are ill-defined, Jennifer Connelly's performance is pretty wooden, there doesn't seem to be much going on in the way of characters outside of a vague coming-of-age through-line, the dialogue is cringeworthy at many points, and overall there just doesn't seem to be much happening in the way of a story. But it's also full of puppets singing and dancing, bouncy 80s tracks, and David Bowie walking around, clearly having a heck of a time singing amongst these ridiculous creatures and calling himself the Goblin King. There are no amount of flaws you could insert into that screenplay that'd even put a dent in just how much fun the whole thing is. Similarly, Suicide Squad may have played things safe, had poorly realised characters, an awkward structure, and some of the worst editing in a motion picture, but at the end of the day, it, at the very least, managed to satisfy casual audiences because the main cast were allowed to crack a smile every now and then, and the whole thing wasn't solely a one-note ordeal that in no way reflected real human beings of our own world. That's part of the reason my favourite bad movie of them all is Face Off, because it finds a way to achieve both ends of the spectrum, being so obscure and schlocky that you can have fun with it, but also so dramatic at times, it makes the bad moments even funnier. It embraces its cheesy conceit and gives us some of the most theatrical performances possible, but when director John Woo tries to go for the serious moments amidst such a ridiculous plot, the entire thing becomes an absolute riot. Sometimes just approaching something with an attitude of wanting to be enjoyable on some level, or having a bit more levity or emotional range somewhat indicative of real life, can be a saving grace. And while it may be entirely possible that the World of Warcraft games were exactly as downbeat as the movie suggested, I'd argue that the film's dour execution and insistence to not embrace the goofier spirit of absurdity that comes with the material was its biggest downfall. I mean, come on man, your film's about trolls and ogres and green magic, lighten up. Whereas while Gods of Egypt was so awfully written, acted and visualised that I'm amazed a major studio even backed it, its shameless spirit of enjoyment just encourages you to go along for the ride, no matter how bad the thing may be. What does all this prove? Hell if I know. But it's interesting to think about just what can be a saving grace in these instances, because while I completely acknowledge that Warcraft and Gods of Egypt are two very different films aspiring towards very different things, I still think that had Warcraft treated its own material with a bit more absurdist humour or just lightened up a little bit, like Gods of Egypt did, something might have been salvaged from the mess. And that maybe, just maybe, we should be making these blockbusters a tad more emotionally well-rounded as something to fall back on, just in case? Because your movie can be a lot of things, but bad and dull? That just sucks. Cheers for watching guys, and as always if you like this video, you can subscribe to my channel.